Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast is all about church planting in the Canadian context. So whether you are a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more about Canadian church planting, we believe this podcast is for you. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we'd ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you're using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Welcome back, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. It is good to have you with us today for another one of our conversations. If this is your first time listening with us, a special welcome. If this is you returning after listening to a past episode, I hope that this podcast thus far has been an encouragement to you. As I've shared in past episodes, would love for you to engage with us online. You can do so through Instagram or through Twitter, or X as it's now called, at the Sowers Pod. You can also email ask@thesowerspod.ca to ask any questions, make any comments, and in future episodes, I'd love to feature some of those comments and share how people have been interpreting, understanding, or being encouraged by this podcast broadly. That would be amazing. Well, our theme for today's conversation is the province of Quebec. Quebec is a province in the nation of Canada, which you are likely familiar with. The population of Quebec is 8.8 million people. 8.8 million people. As I've shared in a past episode, the Greater Toronto Hamilton area has a population of 8.7 million people. And so here today, we're talking about the 8.8 million that live in the province of Quebec. This is, again, close to almost another quarter of the Canadian population. And so if you think about the Greater Toronto Hamilton area is 8.7, Quebec having 8.8, you add those two numbers together, and we're getting close to about half the total population of Canada. And so telling stories, understanding a bit of the history of Quebec, and understanding these two regions in the country of Canada is extremely important for us as we think about church planting in the Canadian context. Well, today you're going to hear a conversation that I had with Jacques Avakian. Jacques is the Seine City missionary with the Seine Network in the city of Montreal, Quebec. He is a colleague, he's a friend, and I think you will be deeply encouraged by hearing him share a bit about his own personal history, his history in the province of Quebec, and also the work that he is doing coming alongside churches and church planters to see churches planted that will reach the Quebecois. Well, I won't take any more of your time. Let's now jump into my conversation with Jacques Avakian. Well, Jacques, I want to thank you so much for joining the Sowers Podcast today. It's such a blessing to have you on.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Would you please begin for our listeners talking to us about your story of coming to know Christ? Where did you grow up? And then how did you come to know Jesus?
It's going to be a colorful story. The fact that I come from different background, living in a certain country and then moving to another country. So let me start by saying that I was descendant-wise from this, like my descendants are Armenian. My grandparents were born in Turkey. I don't know. My parents were born in Lebanon, and I was born in Lebanon. And grew up in Lebanon till the age of 15, where the civil war caused us to escape and go to the island of Cyprus. And while I was living in Lebanon, my family were I would say my mom is a very devout Catholic. She was a prayer warrior. I'm a second twin, or I would say another twin, I have a twin brother, and my name is Jacques. His name is Joseph. And my mom lost a child before us, and she prayed that God would, not hurt. So anyway, through her prayer, we were born, and I was named Jacques. That was my grandfather's name. And my brother Joseph, that was I was actually Saint Joseph. My mom named him after Saint Joseph because she prayed to Saint Joseph. But from childhood, my parents said to us that they felt my brother and I were very spiritual, like we loved spiritual things. So I would say that the age of, very young age, because we attended Catholic school, we were very, I could say, seeking spiritual things, my brother and I. And then later on in life, we met some evangelicals when I was about 8 and 9. And they were missionaries who called, I think they were from an organization called ECF, CFE, Child Evangelism, CEF, sorry, Child Evangelism Fellowship. And they took us to a store and they gave us the gospel with a little book where it said our hearts are black. Then the red page was the blood of Christ that washed us. Now we are white, and pure, and one day we'll be with Christ forever. So I raised my hand at the age of 9, getting saved, not knowing what is happening, had known what the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church had taught. But then later on, throughout the years, as I was part of the Scout movement, and it was called Christ the King. That was our troop's name, Christ the King. And the Maronite Church, now Lebanon has Catholics, they also have Maronites, which is M-O-R Knights, Maronites. And this priest used to preach the gospel. And I remember when I was a Cub Scout and a Scout, I would just listen to him and I would just absorb everything he said about the Word of God. To make a long story short, moved to the island of Cyprus, escaped from the war in Lebanon. We lost our home, we lost everything. That's a whole different story of my miracle of how I survived the war, because I should be dead. But went to Cyprus and ended up going to an evangelical brethren-run school called Logo School. And that's where I heard the gospel more clearly. This was in 78 about. And my English wasn't very good, but from what I understood, one day at school, the teacher said, we made promises to God, but we never keep them. But God's promises are always yea and amen. And I remember on that day praying during the war to survive, because it was like I said, it's a long story. I said, Lord, if you let me live, I'll give you my life. And kind of the Holy Spirit pierced my heart that day and said, Jacques, you made a promise to me. It's time to keep it.
Wow.
So I raised my hand and I kind of said to the Lord, I'm yours, do whatever you want with me. Even though I had accepted Christ before, this was the day I really felt like it was the time I said, okay, Lord, I belong to you. You let me live. I am yours. And that's when I came to the Lord. And in the Christian school where we were, there were many missionary kids. Met a lot of missionaries in Cyprus for many years. I lived there 8 years. Grew up in the Brethren Church, solid doctrine, very strong, very mission oriented. Met many missionaries. And I got my calling, I would say, to missions when I was about 17. I went to a conference on missions and I said, okay, Lord, I'm yours, do whatever you want with me. So in brief, that is a little bit my story, coming to Christ and
wow,
and being called to mission.
Wow. So you said that as part of this story, God, if I survive, I'll commit my life to you. At what point how long were you in Cyprus? And then what brought you to Canada?
Yeah, I lived in Cyprus altogether about 8 years. So from 78 to 86. I graduated in 82 high school, and I did computer programming and everything, but Cyprus wouldn't give us nationality to be able to work. So I was working under the table a little bit, trying to survive, like any other person. And then in 85, my cousins who were already in Montreal called us and said, hey, Canada or Quebec has a special project for Lebanese. If you guys come here, you get your work visa very quickly, and why don't you consider it? So my sister and I, my older sister, we decided to sell everything, and we packed our bags, bought a one-way ticket, and came to Montreal. And that's what brought me to Quebec in 11th of August, 1986. I moved to Montreal. I came to Montreal.
Wow. And at that time, could you speak French?
Yes, I knew French because I learned French back in Lebanon, but I hadn't used it for 8 years. So I was kind of rusty. And I spoke the Parisian French, which was a little bit different than the Quebecois French.
Okay. So then talk to us about arriving in Montreal. What was that experience like? What was Montreal like at the time?
Yeah, 1986 was a different year. I mean, we heard stories, being from the Middle East, you hear about Canada being a cold, cold country where it gets so cold that your ears will freeze and fall off and your nose will freeze and fall off. So when I arrived to Montreal and I was driving from the airport, my cousin came to pick us up and we're going to their home. I was like, wow, this looks just like Cyprus. It's just a little bit different, greener. There's population, there are people, there are cars, nobody's living in igloos.
Wow.
So my concept of Canada changed a lot. Montreal was a busy place. It was different. Of course, the first couple of days I got here, all my cousins showed up and welcomed me and everything. And then when I started hearing them speaking French, I was like, this is not even French. This is like a whole different other language. I was so surprised of the accent that they had. And it took me a while to adjust. My sister and I were looking for a church, so we started looking at the yellow pages, and I found a French church. Went there to listen on one Sunday, and it went over my head. I didn't understand the word.
And how old were you? How old were you at the time, Jacques?
I was 23. I was
Okay.
23 years old, yeah, at the time, and we came here. And then within a month and a half or two, I got my work permit. Went through all the immigration processes and everything, and the Lord was good. And yeah, so that was kind of my first arrival to Quebec. And work. Well, I didn't have find work for a while. I did a couple of jobs in the beginning, so got settled slowly.
Okay. And what would you say the state of Christianity at the time was like in Montreal and then throughout the province of Quebec?
Yeah, well, you know what? The 80s and the 90s were actually a good time for Quebec when it came to evangelical movement. I mean, when I first arrived, people were more open to listening. Of course, you have to know the history of Quebec. I was really privileged and honored to teach in a high school the history of Quebec and Canada, and I learned a lot by teaching that course in high school at a Christian school. And if you knew the history of Quebec with the Quiet Revolution that took place, with the exodus of all the Catholics from the church, and the Quebecois culture completely denying or turning their back on the church, there were some people who were still seeking God. So it was a good time in the 80s and 90s where you would say a lot of people did come to the Lord. A lot of churches were planted, and especially by American missionaries and Canadian missionaries who had come here to teach the Quebecois how to plant churches. So I would say it was a good time people were receptive more to the gospel than today. But at the time, I remember when I was part of a church plant, that we used to go out in the streets and do fine. We did, we passed out tracts, we did door to door, and everything was actually accepted at the time. Today, it's you can't do that anymore. I mean, you can do mime in the street, you can do preaching, but somebody at some point will come and tell you to stop because whether, for some reason, because you're offending anybody, you can't do door to door. There are a lot of bylaws now in a lot of the cities and the boroughs where you can't do door to door. So yeah, it's a different, at the time it was much different. I would say the gospel was more received, not everybody, but still was better than what it is today.
And what led to that transition? And maybe, Jacques, it would be helpful for you to give us kind of a broad overview of the history of Quebec. I think if you're the average Canadian, which I'm going to consider myself the average Canadian who did not grow up in Quebec and only heard about a little bit of the history through elementary school, took French until the point that I didn't have to take it anymore. That was at least my experience. I think the Quebec experience, as I've come to have a greater understanding of it over the last year, has really helped me understand Canada and the Quebecois. Could you provide for us a brief overview of that history of Quebec, which then leads us to present day and why the state of Quebec is what it is as it relates to Christianity?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. To give you a good, clear understanding of Quebec, I mean, when you look at the history of Quebec, Quebec is French compared to the rest of Canada. So at one point, Canada was the Nouvelle France, which is the new France. And a lot of French were coming here to settle and do work. And then, of course, because of the Great War in Europe, what happened was the British won that war. And one of the deals was that they would take Canada. So the British came here and they kind of assimilated or came in through Quebec City, conquered, pillaged, killed, and did all sorts of atrocities. And therefore, that feud between Protestant, which was considered English, and French, which was considered Catholic, that feud has been going on for a long time. And because of that history, Quebecers are very anti-Protestant, anti-English. Our plates here, our car plates, for the cars, they say "Je me souviens," I remember, which very often, if you ask people what does that mean, it's not "I remember the good days." I remember how the British treated us and how they kept us ignorant. And because of the occupation of the British for a long time in Quebec, the people of Quebec were not educated well. They kept them at the low level of society. The British they were the owners of the businesses. The British started the universities and so forth. And there are many, because of that situation, a lot of things have changed today. And we see things because of the history of Quebec. So because of that feud between the Catholics and the Protestant, and because of the British and the French, that has been going on. And they've been always anti-Protestant. And evangelicals fall under that umbrella of Protestantism. So therefore, they're very evangelicals. In the 50s, when missionaries arrived here, they would end up actually in jail. They were beaten, they were kicked, their houses were destroyed. A lot of things happened to them, and many did end up in prison. Now, when the Quiet Revolution took place in the 60s, when finally they realized that the Catholic Church and the British government were working together in keeping the people here ignorant and uneducated, that's when everything switched. And now Quebec woke up and kind of turned their back. In the 50s, 96% of Quebecers would attend Catholic Church. The priest would come to your home and make sure that you were having lots of kids. I mean, if you look back in the history of Quebec, families were like made up of between 8 to 14 to 16 kids per family. They wanted to populate. And so they kept them ignorant, they kept them poor. And then when this happened, this Quiet Revolution happened, divorce rates went up like crazy. First of all, people were just staying together. Quebec is the first, well, not the first province, it's the only province in Canada where when you get married, your wife actually keeps her own name. She can't take your name. So they keep their legal name. Some kids have both families' names, which is really complicated. Because divorce rates were so high, the government came up with that plan. Education became free because before it was so expensive and not available that today education is very available and free for a lot of people here in Quebec. So a lot of the Quiet Revolution situation that switched Quebec to the other side made them kind of anti-biblical, anti-Christ, anti-church. And that's why today's reality of Quebec is that we are no longer interested in religion because we know what religion did to us in the past and how it kept us slaves. So there's a lot of more things that I could share about, but this is kind of giving you a 32,000-foot look at Quebec and its history. Of course, now we have a new generation that has come out. The baby boomers aren't there anymore. We have a new generation who are seeking spiritual things. But because of that, I would say turning back from the Catholic Church or turning their back to the Catholic Church, they opened up to everything and anything else. So they're proud about their openness to a lot of things here. And we don't have to go through all of them, but I know that most people know what they are. And Quebec is known for its openness to sexuality because of the French culture, to alcohol and drugs and everything else that we have here. Even other religions that are very open here. That people say, oh yeah, So it's now a melting pot kind of whoever comes in, and people are like, well, if this is what you feel, then great for you, but don't push it on me. They don't like to have somebody push their values on themselves. They want to think of for themselves and be free to decide what they want to do. So I don't know if that gives you answers a little bit of what you were asking for me. So
yeah, that's very helpful. A couple of things come to mind. One you talked about is that in the 80s and 90s, there was at least some openness to evangelicalism, and then maybe a shift in the 2000s. Why that shift from what you can see and observe?
Yeah, what I noticed, and the funny thing is, from between the year of 2001 and 2004, I left Quebec. I was a missionary in Cyprus with my wife and the kids. And when we came back, we saw even the shift, like as if in the year 2000, I'll tell you some of the things that happened. These are some of the symptoms. A lot of churches started pushing that, the Y2K. Can you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Churches said, oh, Armageddon is coming. You need to buy, food for, $4,000 worth of food so that in case, the power's going to go and this is going to go and that's going to go. So there was that push and even the late 90s had already started where churches were becoming more legalistic and judgmental in their way of doing things, especially evangelical churches. The problem was a lot of the churches that were started didn't have any coaching, didn't have any mentors. They didn't have people that were well balanced to be able to help pastors and planters to understand what is the church, how does the church influence the community, what do we do? They went from literally like what the Catholic Church did. The evangelicals did the same thing. There was a lot of judgment on the people. It became very sectarian. It became very inclusive. It's just about us. We didn't want anybody else to come in. We became more like social clubs, and that didn't help the church, the evangelical church, at all. And people also started, with a World Wide Web with the internet coming, everything that you see on the internet today, and people opened up and they saw what there is. And it kind of really changed the church's way and mission and values of, seeing Quebec as a mission field. And it became more like saying, oh, this is a hard mission field, so we don't want to go. So a lot of churches kind of withdrew rather than go out, because they did get not persecution, but they got rejection, I would say, and couldn't handle the rejection. So they said, fine, they don't want to hear about us, then we'll stay in our corner. And if they want to come to see us, then they are welcome. And that's what happened. And a lot of churches did die. And because there were also a lot of church plants happening, there were some divisions that were happening among churches, and also disagreements on doctrine and different things. So we got, a network of churches, or a few churches, that were starting now to bicker with each other, rather than have a mission to say, how can we reach the lost, and how can we make Quebec a place where people can know about the gospel? So a few factors.
Yeah, so people were finding out about the need in Quebec. And could you just share with us, what is the need of Quebec? I've heard that it's the least reached, the Quebecois are the least reached people group in all of North America. Is that true?
I mean, if you look at it in North America, because of the population we have, Quebec is about 8.3 million now, 4 million. And I would say 60% of the population are French Quebecois. So most of the plants that we've been seeing since the year 2005 to today, I would say 85 to 90% are ethnic churches. The Quebecois churches, they're not planting that many, and people don't want to reach them because they know that many of them will not respond well to the gospel, and they don't want to because of the history of Quebec too. The reason they are also the least reached is because it is a tough mission field. To plant a church in Quebec, it's not going to happen. Like, it won't be self-sustaining for a long, long time. Some churches even have been planted for 15, 20 years. They're still not self-sustaining. Because of the history of Quebec and what the church did to the people here, wanting them to tithe all the time, that when that shift happened, today they don't give. They're not generous to the church. They're generous to any humanitarian work that is happening. Earthquake happens, they will send money, they will send help. A lot of Quebecois will travel down to Cuba or other countries, and they will bring food, and they'll bring clothes, and they will leave them there. But when it comes to actually helping the church or seeing through the eyes of the church, doing humanitarian work, they don't see that. So it has become the toughest place to plant, because they just even don't stay at the church. After a while, they'll come, they'll live the buzz, and they'll go, oh, this is great, but then I'm going to go to the next thing. They're how shall I say? I would say that a lot of the Quebecois are sensitive. I'm trying to find the word there. Sensitive? Yeah, they're sensitive, but this is what happens when your English is not your first language. When you're looking into living a high experience, emotional experience, sensationalism. There we go. Yeah. And they're very sensational. So they look for emotional experiences. And that's why I would say our charismatic churches in Quebec they draw more people in than our more balanced churches or more conservative churches, because they like the senses. There you go, the word again.
Yes. Yeah.
So you know what I mean. So their lack of commitment to the church is not there. Most of my conversation with pastors and planters today is people are not staying. They don't attend regularly, and they haven't. And where in the 80s and 90s, people were committed, and people wanted to be discipled, and people wanted to, be part of a local church and grow. Now it's just changed a lot. And the 2000s brought a lot of change on different viewpoints of the world and everything else.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Jacques Avakian in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Send Network Canada. Send Network Canada is churches working together to plant churches across the nation of Canada in partnership with the Canadian National Baptist Convention and the North American Mission Board. Send Network Canada is a growing Canadian network. In the Send Network Canada, they value seeking first the kingdom, believing that God is at work locally and globally. They value deepening devotion, that without prayer and the word, we believe that we are powerless. They value sticking together, that they are a family united by mission. They value thinking multiplication, that God's global mission demands disciples and churches that multiply. And then their final value is engaging your city, believing that the gospel changes lives, families, and community. If you'd like to learn more about the Send Network, you can visit them at sendnetwork.ca. Once again, that is sendnetwork.ca. And now back to my interview with Jacques. Well, it's something that, again, probably the average Canadian would be familiar with if they're following the news, is a law that was introduced in Quebec around religious symbols. Can you share a little bit about that law and then connect it to the history and where that comes from, once again, for people that might not have a good idea of why such a law might exist?
Yeah, actually, because of the immigration inflow of people coming here, and of course, everybody wanted to raise their banner of their religious faith, Quebec decided that, we want to be a non-faith-based community or, province, and therefore we're going to ban every religious symbols that people wear. You can't push that on other people because people get offended and so forth. So remember, I was talking about being sensitive earlier. They're very sensitive to being offended by others. Remember, they come from a very insecure background because of their past and how the English treated them and how they even view themselves. So I would say the reason they went through that is because they said, if you're wearing the cross, if you're wearing, a crescent or whatever you're wearing, you're going to offend somebody else. So any positions in the government that you hold and the government is paying you, you can't kind of show off your religious faith, and you can't even talk about it. So that came into place because they wanted to make sure that the government didn't have any value system in place that would influence the decisions that the government will make. By removing all, faith-based values, then we can be a non-religious community, or, communauté laïque, we say in French, which is non-faith-based community. So that was the mindset behind it. And even the cross that was in the parliament, some people decided to move it because, and then at one point some debate was, well, this is our heritage, we should keep it. But finally they did remove the cross too. The cross used to be always present in the parliament here in the Quebec government. So that was the mindset behind it.
And it's very interesting, right? Because as much as they're saying we don't want these faith-based values to govern us, they are espousing their own faith-based values in a way as well, which guides them in their decisions. As you think about the province of Quebec, as you think about the Québécois, I think that there is an incredible principle here as it relates to church planting, as it relates to people thinking about being missionaries to a culture, and that is to understand and relationally engage the history to therefore understand how to contextually share the gospel. Could you share with us 4 or 5 things that you believe are necessary considerations for somebody that wants to reach the Québécois, examples of contextualizing the gospel to reach a particular people?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Well, I don't know if I told you this, but I'm married to the culture. My wife is French Canadian. We've been married for 30 years. Actually, all of us, my sister, my young brother, and myself, we all married French Canadian. My twin brother is married to a German. But we all married outside of our culture. So I could say we are true missionaries. We kind of adopted another culture as our own. The Quebecois culture are very unique. They are fun people. I mean, they really enjoy laughter. Quebec is the only place that has a comedy school. So we love to do comedy. But sometimes the comedy is kind of distorted, which is not very good. It's too vulgar sometimes. The other thing is, I find that Quebecois, one thing you need to realize is you need to really listen to them before they open up to you. There is a very superficial relationship in the beginning. It is very shallow. But as you take time to get to know them, and the more time you take to listen and hear their process of thought, where they're coming from, what has been their upbringing, finding out their history, and all that, that really helps to understand how I can share the gospel with them. I've learned over the years that the best way is to ask a lot of questions. When you ask questions, you know where their frame of reference is, where they're coming from. And I've never had any Quebecois say to me, don't pray for me. because I've taken the time to understand where they are, where they're coming from. And then I could say, hey, I can pray for this thing that you're going through in your life. So listening is one key. Asking good questions is another one. The other one is finding out their adventure or their story, what led them to where they are today, and what is their history family-wise, the dynamic of their family too, finding out about their personal life, finding out about their future also, like what they would like to do in the future, or what are they aiming for in life, finding out what they're doing. And yet, when I've seen transformation of Quebecois going from being somebody very negative to somebody very positive, and the transformation is amazing. I mean, I was a pastor of a French Quebecois church for 10 years, and when a Quebecois came to the Lord, it took a while. It could take a couple of years before they came to the Lord, even though they came to church. But then once they committed, they were really committed, and the transformation was amazing. So when God transforms, no matter what the cultural background is. Yes, Quebecois are maybe a challenge to reach, but when God saves, God transforms, God reconciles, and God heals. So when you do that, and you take time you have to be patient with them. That helps a lot in seeing them come to Christ. So listening, asking good questions, being patient with them, and finding out what their story is has helped. I would say 4 things that has helped me to really connect well with the Quebecois. And the other thing I've done is I've actually adopted their culture as mine. So I've learned the slang words, I've learned the nuances, the funny nuances. So when they say something, I laugh with them because I understand where they're coming from. If I use a Armenian or a Lebanese or Greek nuance, they're not going to get it. But where I immerse in their culture and I make them feel that they are important, that has helped a lot with the advancement of the gospel in their lives and being open to receiving the gospel, but at the same time being open to share what is happening deep inside each one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, those are amazing things. Pursuing fun, listening. I think even the reality there of trusting God, that God transforms. Those are some incredible things. I think things that, whether you're reaching the Quebecois or not, those are incredible principles for reaching people. What would you say you're seeing work as far as church plants in Quebec, churches that are having evangelistic growth? Would there be similarities to what you've seen as far as church plants in other part of the country? Would there be some uniquenesses in the churches that you're seeing and you're giving oversight to in Quebec in the way that they're reaching the Quebecois that we could all learn from?
Well, we do have our own challenges within our own context. For us, I don't know if it's the same elsewhere in Canada, but in Quebec, a church is registered as a nonprofit organization, a religious nonprofit organization. You know this, but there's no church and state here. It's only state, and churches fall under nonprofit organizations. So for us, the greatest challenge is location. The government and the cities here don't want to give permits to meet, and that's been the greatest challenge here. But despite that, God has been at work, and people have been planting churches, and some creative ways of finding locations to meet and so forth has been put in place with some of our church planters. One guy decided to open a kind of a hall or a reception place where he's got like 4 churches that meet in that place, but they also do bar mitzvahs, they do receptions, they do different things, and it's being part of the rent and it's helping. The challenge also is because of the location also, a lot of our members here do not tithe properly, and we've always had an issue with tithing here because of the culture and the background. If it's Quebecois, it's because of the history. If it's refugees or new arrivals or immigrants, then they're sending money back home to their country to take care of their family. So the financial part of it, to get a good sustainability for a local church or a church plant, has always been a challenge here. But despite that, God has been good. God has brought some partners. We have, of course, the North American Mission Board, who has helped us with planting churches here. And we have really some creative ways that guys have done. And I would say 95% of our pastors are co-vocational here. We don't have many planters who are full-time. And we only have a few that have decent givers in their church. And usually that either falls in the English community, or the Quebecois that is, settled, those who have been in the church for a long time, that have a good core group that is solid, and they are, like I said earlier, the Quebecois, when he's transformed, he will tithe properly and even beyond. So I would say that those are some of the challenges, but at the same time, we have seen a lot of ethnic churches planted. God is at work. I always tell people my strategy is pray, pray, and pray, and God will bring the workers that He is preparing. And now it's that shift that is happening where we're trying to get our churches, even our Quebecois churches that are being planted. You would see a lot of ethnics coming to those churches. It's not anymore, there's a lot of diversity now in our church plants. You don't see just one culture. You see multiculturalism. Our Spanish churches have multiple Spanish speaking cultures. Our French have different French, multiple ethnic groups. Even our Arabic churches have different Arabic speaking people in them. So one thing has changed, I would say, in church planting now is that openness to being open to different cultures. Now it's more linguistic rather than cultural. And that has really helped a lot in the planting movement here, because we have seen God bring some African pastors who are reaching Haitians, some Haitian pastors who are reaching Africans. We have some Quebecois who are reaching Haitians, and it's been mixed. So, but God's been doing some great work. La Chapelle has multiplied a couple of times, one of our good churches, and they're really reaching the Quebecois a lot. But even though they're reaching the Quebecois, among them you will see a lot of young ethnic, second generation immigrants who are coming to that church because they can relate better to the culture than their own parents' churches that were more culturally, contextual for them. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers your question, but really God has been at work. We've seen, when I started as a church planting catalyst in 2007, we had about 27 churches here. And over the years, as I've been serving here for 15 years, we have seen 80 churches planted. Some of them have closed. 25% of them did close. They just didn't survive. Some closed because of the very few closed of the pandemic. Not even, I can think of any that closed because of the pandemic, but they reoriented themselves and God's been blessing them. And so, I think God loves the Quebec very much, and He is bringing the right laborers for this field. It is a challenging field, but those who have come, they've been doing it with joy, with perseverance, with passion, and they haven't complained. And whatever God has, given extra, they prayed the Lord for it. I'm really proud of our planters here in Quebec. They've been doing some amazing, amazing work.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the church La Chapelle, and we're going to have David, the pastor of La Chapelle, on the podcast in a couple of months. And I'm just mindful, Jacques, for you that you said to the Lord, God, keep me alive and I'll serve you. And you continue to do that in Quebec, in the city of Montreal. Could you share with us a couple of stories of people transformation, individuals responding to the gospel in Quebec?
Sure. A couple of weeks ago, actually in August, we went to a baptism in one of our Spanish churches. And it was amazing to see these 7 people, each one of them give their testimony. They took time for each one of them to give their testimony. And one testimony after another, it was just amazing to see how God has orchestrated everything in their lives to bring them exactly where they need to be, and how they met the pastor of that church, and how, God led them. Some of the stories were amazing. Some had to walk, out of their country to another country and then walk in the desert while their wife was pregnant. 13-year-old girl who just said, and as she was weeping, as she was saying how God transformed her life and how it's been just an amazing thing that has happened in her life to, come to Christ. And story after story, as you hear them, we were all weeping because of their amazing stories, how God had touched their lives and how unique each one of them is. I can really honestly say that every testimony that happened in Quebec is a miracle story. Whatever church I'm visiting, a couple of weeks ago, I went to another Haitian church up in about an hour away from Montreal, Haitian church, and they had 4 baptisms. And the 4 baptisms were actually 4 young ladies who had committed their lives to the Lord. They were between the age of 17 and 19. And God has been really reaching people one by one, and their lives are really, really changed because of the gospel. They didn't share all the details of their lives, but many of them would realize that they were, seeking wrong things, and they were looking for a way out, and God provided through our churches. And that's the story has been, I would say, throughout our churches here. Many of them have just been people that were lost, were looking for community. They found a community and the gospel transformed them and they came to Christ. La Chapelle baptized, I think 17 people last April, and every story is unique. I can't tell you all the stories one by one, but you can tell that every church, for every person that they are baptizing, they have taken the time to invest in them. And they have really, really invested in them in such a way that has transformed their life. And I could say our baptism have gone up a lot this last couple of years because people are really focusing to reaching the lost. And I could honestly say that every story is unique. From my head, to tell you a story, like one story unique, it'll be very difficult because I've heard so many. It would be difficult for me to just pick one out because there were so many that have been amazing stories of how God has transformed them and brought them to Christ. So I'm thankful to God for what he's doing through our churches, and it's been a blessing.
And how can we be praying for you, Jacques, and how can we be praying for the province of Quebec?
Well, for me, Matt, I mean, my couple of roles that I wear, all the different roles that I have. So I'm just praying that God will keep me sane throughout all those, try to balance my time with family, with, even my own time for myself so I can be with the Lord regularly. Very rare. I mean, I do have sometimes I can sit down with the Lord, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. So that helps. But just that the Lord will give me the strength, the capacity to do the different roles. Please pray that God will surround me by people who have time to help because, in Quebec, one of the things that I've noticed, if you don't pay somebody, they don't want to do it. Everybody wants to get paid to do something. So having volunteers or having team members who would say, hey, we're there to hold your arms, like, Moses had some help during the battle, that would be nice. So pray that God will surround me with it, team members who will be willing to be along, walk alongside with me with the different roles that I have. And then pray that the Lord will raise laborers for his harvest. That's been my strategy from the beginning when I took this role as a church planting catalyst. And I said, Lord, I know I can't do it. It doesn't matter how many relationships I have, how many strategies I put in place. If you don't raise the leaders, if you don't call them, if you don't equip them, if you don't provide for them, none of it's going to happen. So I've learned to kind of just sit at the feet of the Lord like Mary and just cry out to him and say, Lord, Quebec, remember Quebec. do what needs to be done. So I would say those are the 3 requests that I have for if people want to pray for us. I'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jacques, for joining the Sowers podcast. And we be praying for you as you continue to minister in your context.
Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate the time. And it was a privilege and an honor to be with you.
Friends, I'm sure you would agree with me that there is so much for all of us to learn as it relates to the history of Quebec and therefore the application of the gospel in this province in Canada. I know that every time I have a conversation with someone from the province of Quebec who understands the history in Quebec, I gain a greater understanding and a greater clarity as to the Quebecois people. And I think that raises for us an important action step coming out of this episode. And the action step is related to the understanding of people's stories and history and why their stories and their history may be a barrier that they have to understanding or having any interest in knowing about your faith. I think it's imperative to understand someone's history, to understand their story, in order for you to therefore be able to enter into relationship with them and share with them the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the contextual work that we don't always think about when we just hear go and share the gospel, but there's often a history and a background to individuals and to people. And those that we are in relationship with, we have the opportunity to ask good questions about their background, about their history, which then gives us a better understanding and gives you in particular a better understanding of how you could share the gospel with them in a way that they can understand based upon their background and their history. And so who is somebody that you sense that God is inviting you to care for, to love on? Do you know their history? And what are some things that you could do or questions that you could ask over the next couple of weeks to get to know their history and their story a little bit better? once again, the importance of understanding someone's background and history as you think about sharing the gospel with them. Well, friends, thanks once again for listening to this episode. If this has been an encouragement to you, I'd invite you to share it with someone else. Leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. You are loved.